a session entitled Global Issues, I better use the microphone, Global Issues in Nuclear Security, Looking Ahead to the Next Decade. We've got three panelists with us this afternoon, and I will be moderating this panel. Each of our panelists will speak for a few minutes, about 5 to 7 minutes, and provide a little bit of an overview of their perspective of this question. Then I will lead with some questions from the group, then we'll go back and forth, questions from the audience, questions from me, and we'll move through this program, and hopefully we can have a very interactive session with all of us this afternoon. Introducing our panelists, I'll start with Brandon Prinz. Brandon is a professor of political science here at the University of Tennessee. Former Director of Graduate Studies, correct, Dr. Prinz?
Correct.
Correct. And he is a Global Security Fellow here at the Baker Center. Brandon's research interests include conflict processes among nation states, theoretical models of international politics, the role played by domestic/political institutions in affecting leader decisions to use military force, particularly in democratic settings, and the relationship between Congress and the President in directing and implementing foreign policy, including the use of force, foreign aid, and military interventions. Brandon received his PhD and MA in political science from Michigan State University. Second, Howard Hall. Dr. Hall is the director of the UT Institute for Nuclear Security that's housed here at the Baker Center. He is appointed as the UT and Oak Ridge National Laboratory Governor's Chair, Professor of Nuclear Security, and serves as faculty in both the Department of Nuclear Engineering and the Bredesen Center for Interdisciplinary Research and Graduate Education. Dr. Hall is also a senior fellow in global security policy here at the Baker Center, where he directs our global security programs. Howard's research interests, broad, diverse, but at the core, nuclear forensics, nuclear chemistry and radiochemistry, radiation detection and measurement as applied to security relevant needs, and nuclear security policy and the interface between technology, policy, and legal frameworks. Howard received his PhD in nuclear and radiochemistry from the University of California, Berkeley, and before joining UT, Howard spent more than 20 years at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Third, Dr. Bruce Williamson, one of my own as an economist. Bruce is senior economist at the Institute for Nuclear Security, and his work in defense and national security economics is very broad, far-reaching. Includes comparative analyses of major defense acquisition, cost, schedule, and performance, the use of public-private partnerships in modernizing the national nuclear security infrastructure, and improvements to human reliability testing in highly secure environments. Dr. Williamson has worked in national labs in U.S. and international corporations. You really want me to say for how long? For over 36 years. In market and industrial-based studies, energy and telecommunications networks, consumer expenditure, business modeling, I only have 2 pages to go, valuations of foreign companies and markets for international mergers, and economic analyses of defense acquisition and healthcare in the U.S. He holds a BA from Cornell University in American Foreign Policy and Government, a master's degree in international relations from the Corbell School of International Relations, and a PhD in economics from the University of New Mexico. So please welcome our panelists to the stage today. So let's start. We don't have a queued up here. Do we have volunteers, Brandon?
We aren't queued up, do we? Sure. Oh, all right. Do we really need? Okay. Good. I guess this helps.
Yes.
All right. So I guess I would prefer to hear what they have to say, but I guess I'll open up with a few things that I see as important in the coming years in terms of nuclear security, and then I'd actually would like to take questions and hear from the audience more than from myself. But I guess a couple of things strike me as important in considering when thinking in the next 5 or 10 years. So obviously there are preparatory plans right now for the 2015 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is going to happen next year, 2015. So this obviously is a time to reflect on and where non-proliferation is going, how secure nuclear weapons and materials are, what are the commitments of non-nuclear weapon states to halt, reduce proliferation, and then of course what are the responsibilities of the nuclear states to actually disarm, as Article 6 stipulates in the NPT. And I think it will be interesting as we move toward the actual review conference. It is inevitable that the two issues which will be addressed will be Article 6, disarmament, and of course proliferation. That is everybody else's responsibility to ensure that we have a nuclear-free world other than nuclear weapon states. And I suspect that we will reach the same kinds of impasses that we have in the past, which is that non-nuclear weapon states will demand more from nuclear weapon states, and nuclear weapon states will demand more from non-nuclear weapon states, and there will be, I guess, that there will be pledges made, but there probably will be not many concrete actions that are taken, which again I think is frustrating, thinking about efforts to actually move toward global zero and efforts to actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons and warheads that we have in the international system. Right, I do think it's fair that non-nuclear weapon states have really made it a point that NWS as nuclear weapon states have not really honored their commitments under the NPT to disarm. And that more should be done by nuclear weapon states to actually make this a reality. But we'll definitely see pushback from the United States as we have in the past. When it came to the 13 practical steps that were agreed to at the 2000 review conference, really none of these things have gone very far, despite really nuclear weapon states really pledging to take really concrete steps towards disarming. Now, tied to that, I think, is in thinking about whether or not nuclear weapon states will disarm any more than they have, and realize that, you know, there are 9 states that have nuclear weapons. 93% of nuclear weapons are held by 2 states, right? And so when we're talking about disarming, we're talking really about 2 countries who have to reduce their numbers. But of course, the U.S.-Russian relations are going to create problems for all of this, right? So the Crimean intervention and Russian infiltration into Ukraine. And NATO's now pledged to perhaps begin to actually establish military bases in Eastern Europe, which have been talked about, which doesn't de-escalate this crisis to a great extent. Obviously complicate issues with regard to nuclear disarmament. So that clearly is going to be an issue going forward, to see whether or not nuclear cooperation between really the 2 major actors when it comes to nuclear weapons are able to overcome these problems right now and continue to resume what are talks about nuclear disarmament. And one of the problems, of course, is that the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program has expired. And so there is no, as far as I know, there's no public knowledge about where nuclear weapons now are stored in Russia. That is, under the New START Treaty, there is an agreement for Russia and the United States to report to each other on where their nuclear weapons are, but this is not disclosed. Right? This is, as far as I know, this is kept secret. And so we have less information now about where nuclear weapons in Russia are, how they're dispersed, other things, right? So I think that's going to be an issue or a challenge in the future. It also is a challenge in thinking about this, again, going back to the review conference, that none of the 9 nuclear states have really moved toward disarmament. So clearly the United States and Russia haven't. I mean, they have reduced their numbers, but that reduction has been slowing in the last few years. So the pace in which they have been reducing has slowed. Plus, they also have, both countries have modernization plans for nuclear weapons, clearly a signal sent to the international system that they are not really disarming, at least in the immediate future. Right? We have other countries that are both increasing their nuclear weapons and modernizing, right? So we nearly have an arms race when it comes to India and Pakistan. Both are increasing numbers, and both are directed at each other. Israel also, it appears, has plans to modernize some of its nuclear forces. The only country that actually said they were going to reduce their numbers unilaterally was Great Britain, and they haven't done so. France hasn't said anything, but the only country that has so far, I think, is Great Britain. So they aren't great signs with regard to commitments by nuclear weapon states to actually engage the NPT in Article 6. And then lastly, and I'll turn it over, I do think we have to consider state fragility in the international system as it ties or connects to nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. We have a lot of fragile states. Fragile states are associated with a lot of bad things. So fragile states with violence. Fragile states are associated with extensive criminal activity. Fragile states are associated with a lot of corruption, terrorism, insurgency, piracy. All these kinds of things are associated and happen in politically fragile states. And of course, many fragile states, Pakistan being the one that stands out the most, right, because it is one of the most fragile states in the international system, and of course, nuclear weapons. There are great concerns, of course, about nuclear material in these states falling into the hands of bad actors. Talk a little bit more about that. I'm worried, but not super worried. But worried is worried, right, when it comes to nuclear materials. So I do think there has to be more done on the part of the international community to help stabilize these states. Now, of course, there are lots of bad things that come with stabilization, right, especially with autocratic authoritarian states. And even one can stabilize a country by going more authoritarian, or one can stabilize a country by becoming more open, free, and democratic, right? And that transition is extremely difficult to do without lots of instability and potential violence. But I do think that's an issue that needs to be considered, and certainly is an issue that's going to be apparent when it comes to issues of non-proliferation and nuclear weapons concerns, nuclear security in the future. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brandon. Let's just move down the panel here and go with Bruce Williamson next, please.
Does this work?
Does this work? That's working. All right. My focus is a little bit different because I was looking at the what would I be concerned about in the next 5 to 10 years, and I have great faith in the efforts of Howard and others to improve the workings of the international system, as well as coupling that with the forensics. But my concern is more about the ease of producing nuclear weapons. There have been two main approaches to limiting the capability of producing more highly enriched uranium. I'm not going to talk about plutonium here. And the main one that the U.S. chose from the outset was restricting the access to technology. The second way is political economic pressure through relationships and engaging with high-risk countries. So on the technology restriction approach, the basic thesis is that it hasn't worked, and we can only look back at Marco Polo and the Chinese and gunpowder. Marco Polo was very enterprising. I think the Chinese were surprised that the West didn't have it and let him walk away with examples of the formula as well as the idea of rockets. So restricting technology has not been a great approach. And as it was shown quite early on, in fact, some of the individuals, Glenn Seaborg and others, in 1945 pointed out that this technology advantage is only going to last a very, very short time. And in fact, their predictions turned out to be true. The technology moved on to gas centrifuges, and as the UK demonstrated, and the Australians and a number of others, you can build in enrichment a gas diffusion, a gas centrifuge, relatively simply with the technology of a high school machine shop, a few technical individuals, a handful of trades individuals, and you can power it with a diesel generator. The Australians worked, I think the record is that they had it took them 6 years, but at one point they only had 3 individuals working on the project. But they quite successfully demonstrated subcritical centrifuges for enrichment. Raw materials, can you restrict access to uranium? Not really. I think that was actually an idea of the early Atomic Energy Commission, and uranium is just too widely distributed. And it's a matter at that point of metallurgy, refining, purifying ores to get something that's enriched. So this is not a barrier to bad actors in the world. Right now, I think 25 countries have some weapons-grade material. Most of that is with 2 countries. 20 countries of that 25, 20 countries have developed or acquired centrifuge technology with uranium hexafluoride enrichment for either power generation, weapons, or both. So this technology is widely available, and if you want to Google ZIPPE type centrifuges, ZIPPE, it was an Austrian who was captured by the Soviets, and when he got back to the West, he was amazed that the West hadn't already turned away from, particularly the US, hadn't turned away from gaseous diffusion to subcritical centrifuges. And in fact, the Soviets had been down that path since 1954. With the help of these Germans who were captured at the end of World War II. So the techniques are widely available. We've got Australia, Brazil, China, France, Germany, India, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Italy, Japan, Libya, Netherlands, North Korea, Pakistan, South Africa, Russia, Sweden, the UK, and the US all have gas centrifuge technology. The 2 points: they're cheap and easy to build, and they're hard to detect. 13 of the 20 centrifuge programs I spoke about were fully indigenous. That is, they were developed, started at least, initial thought, in a few cases initial thought, or carried out to completion with the skills at hand in the country. Of the 7 who received foreign help, in other words, not fully indigenous, 3 actually started programs before they turned to outside help, and that would be Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. So 16 of the 20 understood the potential of the centrifuge process to provide highly enriched uranium. That's scary. Secondly, it's hard to detect. In several countries of great concern to us, we would not have detected their centrifuge enrichment had they not needed help because of a defect in the AGCON plans that he had lifted from the Netherlands. And then when he resold those plans to Pakistan, Libya, and Iran, they ran into issues and went abroad for help. That was the tip-off to Western suppliers and to Western governments that something was going on. But even with national technical means, the US was startled to discover in the mid-60s that when the Chinese detonated their first atomic device, they wondered where they could have gotten the highly enriched uranium from. It was a surprise to the U.S. that they had gas centrifuges, and that they'd picked them up from the Soviets. And then it was only in 1991, according to the literature, that the U.S. realized that the Soviets had been using gas centrifuges since 1954, undetected. So it's possible to get away with it, easy to hide them. So technology restriction, as predicted, I would say is a non-starter. Well, we have to say something about the theft or acquisitions of weapon-grade materials. And thefts have actually occurred fairly frequently. I think the data is there's about 20 thefts in the last 20 years. 2 of those were of weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium or plutonium material. And I don't believe that counts Israel and the NUMEC plant in Apollo, Pennsylvania, where approximately 100 kilograms of highly enriched uranium disappeared in the late 50s, early 60s. But my thought as an economist is, if you're going to steal things, there's a high chance you're going to be detected. Given the economics of running gas centrifuges, you could get a warehouse and a diesel generator and a few individuals and produce enough in a year to make your own bomb. So why risk detection going the alternative route by theft or active attempts to break into storage areas when you could choose a very difficult to detect approach and be quite successful? And the estimate, one source was saying the estimate in 1960 it might have cost about 10 million. Nowadays the estimate is it might cost about 20 million to be able to do this. So 20 million is chump change in the world of international finance. Well, what is to be done, as Lenin once titled one of his books? Well, we've got guards, gates, and guns. You've got insider threat detection. You've got reliability training. You've got careful documentation and accounting. Very, very important. You've got political and economic methods. These are the primary alternatives for preventing proliferation. You've got your treaties, cooperative agreements, conventions, incident reporting, supplier data sharing, meetings, formal and informal diplomacy, and information sharing on best practices as well as incidents, so that you've got a much better informed pool of interested parties and hopefully more agreement on what needs to be done to prevent illicit or dangerous actions by the bad actors that Brandon has been talking about. And of course, there's part of the economic approach is the financial approach, which is looking at trade embargoes or asset seizures. Very, very critical teeth in this whole approach, because all the conventions really don't have teeth that can force a sovereign nation to do something. So verification is absolutely critical, because it helps determine what the case is against a bad actor, and then get allies in line, not necessarily U.S. allies, but those in agreement with non-proliferation, get those in line to take some steps against the bad actors. Well, the other thing about the conventions and agreements is that works well for nations, for state actors. But there's a conspicuous gap with non-state actors. And that is really where my concern is with the ease of gas centrifuges for production of highly enriched uranium. I would say what is left to be done is really up to people like Howard here. You have to remain continually vigilant and be aware of motive and means in non-state actors, as well as a few state actors who have the willingness to harm other countries and other nation states in order to accomplish something. I think microphone
Good time.
technology. Time out. Oh, yeah. The last point I want to make very quickly is, in all this same enrichment technology is a perfect route to create enough enrichment to run nuclear power reactors. So there's a good side and a bad side in all this. And my concern is that in all of our anxiety, and perhaps properly so anxiety, about bad actors in the world, there's a tremendous potential there in nuclear power generation, as well as the blessings we get from using radiological materials and nuclear diagnostics. Things that I think our civilization is far better off for having. But we need to be very skillful in developing our forensic skills and our political skills and getting those things together so that we're acting in the right way to limit the bad uses of nuclear power and not restrict the good uses.
Dr. Hall.
All right, thank you. I must say, when you put the mantle of responsibility on me, it weighs heavily, so thank you, Bruce. Let me speak to a couple of things that my colleagues haven't really touched on yet as well. First, in the immediate future, in about 2 years, we will have what is presumably the last of the nuclear security summits, the international convenings that President Obama began in 2010 following his Prague speech in 2009. And I think it is going to be a very interesting question as to what the future of that process is. So the 2010 and 2012 summits, and then the recent one in 2014 in Europe, have brought some very significant commitments on the international community into the field of nuclear security. We are certainly seeing through the actions not only of governments but also non-governmental organizations a broader and more, I guess, consensus-based groundswell that nuclear security and securing nuclear materials that are at risk is important. This is definitely on the radar screen now. We will face a transition point in the 16 summit. In 2016, of course, President Obama will not be available for re-election. There will be another president of some flavor by the time the next summit should roll around, if it occurs. So we will see several things, I think. One, we will see the question of what is the Obama administration legacy in the Nuclear Security Summit. And so I think the administration will be pushing very hard to try to cement that. That may open up some possibilities for things that have been stalled. For example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty we have been a signatory to for most of my adult life, but we have never ratified. Now, can the administration persuade Congress, specifically the Senate, to ratify it? I'm not 100% convinced. So I think that question remains open. I think the question of how you institutionalize and cement some of the actions, partnerships, and engagements of the Nuclear Security Summit series is also going to be very important. We've seen the IAEA start to take a stronger role in nuclear security. That's a very beneficial outcome. We've seen nations make commitments. They've established nuclear security support centers, training centers, and so forth. We have seen the non-government, or at least the non-federal governmental bodies get engaged. There's a number of academic programs now that, just like we have here at University of Tennessee, are starting to think about how do you engage nuclear security in the curriculum. There's a group at the IAEA, that the IAEA convenes called FinCEN, the International Nuclear Security Educators Network. When this process began, it was a very small group, only about 25, 30 participants. At the most recent INCEN meeting, which finished about 2.5 weeks ago, there were over 120 universities represented. So it's definitely a growing concern. To some extent, it also mirrors the growth of interest in nuclear power around the world. Despite the issues at Fukushima, the growth of nuclear power in what we refer to as nuclear newcomer states, as well as countries like China, is still continuing. And so as these countries continue to develop nuclear technology, building nuclear power plants, potentially building fuel cycle capacity, we do run into these issues that both Brandon and Bruce mentioned of the spread of the technology. And so how do we keep appropriate controls on that? We're also, I think, going to have to look at questions of what are the sort of norms and standards by which we must live in the nuclear security world. When we say highly enriched uranium is secure in a particular country, pick your favorite country that has HEU, does that mean the same thing as when we say a different country has their material secure? How do we judge that? How do we assess that? How do we deal with that, particularly in countries where, for example, in the weapons states, 85% of the nuclear material is in the hands of the military, not in the hand, or in the military industrial complex, not in the hands of the civilian power complex. And so how do you approach that problem? Transparency is a critical concern. And that transparency, I think, is going to be a major sea change, certainly for the United States, certainly for Russia, and for the other weapon states, if we are to bring that 85% of the fissile material that's out there that is currently exempt from the standards of international safeguards into the same sort of transparent, open, accountable realm that we ask of the civilian power industry. I think we're also seeing a growth and an appreciation of the impact of human performance and human culture on security systems. This is an area that I think has been only lightly investigated. The fact of the matter is almost every system that's out there depends on a human to make a decision or to take an action. And those humans operate within a social, cultural, educational framework that affects their decision making. And so understanding how we tailor a security system that works in the US, but may be completely irrelevant to another country, how do you make those leaps? How do you make sure on the international basis that a country, for example, big countries in the Middle East have a much stronger family and tribal relationship base than we have here in the US, and have a much different response to issues of performance management by shaming than we have here in the US. How do you transplant a security system that has its origins in Western thought into that culture and do so effectively. Because you can't just pick it up and set it in and expect it to work. So with that, why don't we turn to the next set of questions?
Very good. I'm going to immediately go off script.
Okay.
So I'll surprise you, gentlemen. Bruce, I'm going to leave you last on this list just to give you a preview because your introductory remarks, I think, led down a path and I know where you're going. So here's the question. Where are we? We're looking forward the next decade. What is the threat? Of all of the things that were discussed here, what is the big threat and how does one deal with it 10 years out? I'm not an expert on the matter, but I think I'm a reasonably informed observer, and I'm worried about non-state action. I'm worried about the evolution of technology. Bruce is going right down the path of your remarks. The technology allows you to do this almost in your garage. And so nation-state treaties, issues of economic and financial sanctions, issues of human reliability and monitoring are irrelevant in that context. So let's start with Brandon, then I'm going to go to, we're going to just always start with Brandon. Then we're going to move to Howard, and then I'll let Bruce chime in with some final remarks on that question.
Okay.
Ask me to repeat the question.
It might take 15 minutes.
Microphone.
Sorry. Thanks. Okay. So I guess I want to push back on the premise of the question just a little bit, because there's a lot of threat inflation that occurs with both terrorism and nuclear weapons and materials, and of course the connection between terrorism and nuclear weapons and materials. It is a threat. We obviously have to be concerned about it. How much we have to be concerned about it, I'm not sure. I mean, for some, it is an existential threat, and so the probability of a nuclear attack does not matter because the consequences are so great, right? So even if that probability is exceedingly low, that is insignificant or unimportant or irrelevant because of the costs associated with the nuclear detonation. In the city, Grant Allison, who heads up the Adamsford, at the Belfer Center, the Adamsford Project, managing the Adams Project. I mean, he wrote a piece which I thought was a real threat inflation piece in 2006, in which he forecast out that Iran was going to test in 2008. There was going to be a chain reaction to Iran's test after that, and the first terrorist nuclear incident was going to occur on September 11th, 2011, 10 years to the date after September 11th, in New York City. None of these things, of course, have happened. So I think we have to be a little bit concerned about threat inflation. The probability of terrorist attack in the United States is really, really, really low. I mean, you are 100 times more likely to be killed, to be killed in a crime, a homicide, than you are to be killed by a terrorist in this country. You're 10 times more likely to be killed by hitting a deer. When you're driving your car, than you are to be killed by a terrorist incident in this country. So there are comparisons that I think we need to make with regard to risk. And I'll stop. But the other thing I think we need to be concerned about is we need to understand the drivers of terrorism really well, right? That is, addressing what are the consequences of terrorism is certainly okay. But I think we need to understand the root drivers of terrorism and terrorists so that we can fundamentally get at what drives these individuals, right? These are rational people who are trying to achieve certain objectives, right? We need to understand what those objectives are so that we can better address exactly that and not just respond with lots and lots and lots of money to trying to prevent what I think is, well, it's probably impossible.
So what are the root drivers?
What are the drivers of terrorism? Well, if you look at where terrorists, if you look at the individual motivations for terrorism, it is grievance, that is an experience of violence. Most terrorism occurs, and terrorists have lived in countries beset by political violence, by insurgency, by government repression, right? Much of that, those governments that are repressing them and experience with violence and government repression, many times has connections to U.S. foreign policy. And so at least they can make that, they have the perception of that, if it's real or not, they have the perception of that, right? And so the bombs being dropped, the family members that are being killed, these are all things that drive individuals to terrorism, right? Solving those insurgencies, solving those civil wars are things that might help to push individuals away. Again, not a lot of people will turn to terrorism. Small sets of people that actually do it. But these things are things that might help to push people away. I do think we have to be, we can't just say that there are lots of terrorists out there, lots of terrorist groups out there, they all want a nuclear bomb. That's not the case, right? I mean, we can single out all terrorist groups that really aren't all that committed. There are only a couple of terrorist groups out there that we would actually be concerned about with regard to obtaining a nuclear weapon. Al-Qaeda was certainly one of them, right on Shiriko, and Japan was another. There are certainly groups that we need to be concerned about, don't get me wrong, right? There are certainly groups we need to be concerned about, but it's not all of them. And focusing on those groups and understanding their motivations, I think, is a useful way of trying to prevent this, rather than just enacting more and more safeguards.
You're next.
Oh, I'm next. Okay. I was trying to pass the bucket. So I think, first let me say, I would disagree slightly with the characterization that the ability to enrich uranium is something quite as simple as was portrayed. I think one would have a fair chance in such a rudimentary process of detecting it by just watching for people showing up with hydrogen fluoride burns to their lungs at local hospitals. Because learning to handle uranium hexafluoride, particularly when it's heated and vaporized, would be non-trivial. So I think there are some technological roadblocks in the way of such a dismal perspective. But that being said, I think that we certainly cannot discount the ability of certainly nation states to come forward in that technology frontier in such a manner that they could proliferate if they so chose. I would like to also come back to one of the points that Brandon made earlier, which is the association of nuclear materials and fully functioning nuclear weapons with fragile states. And so I would be much more concerned about the ability of a sub-state actor to have a moment of opportunity in the event of a failed state or a state that's going through crisis or civil war who also happens to possess nuclear weapons. And that is not, I mean, everyone of course points to Pakistan as the poster child of that. I think certainly Pakistan has issues and considerations. Pakistan has also undertaken a fairly aggressive profile for training their security forces that protect their nuclear operations. We actually had some representatives from Pakistan speak at an IMM meeting about a year ago, and they were pretty clear that if you cross the red line, you're going to get killed. So as long as the guys who are firing the guns are on the right side, I have some confidence that Pakistan has the appropriate level of seriousness about protecting those assets. But if we see a repeat of what happened in Russia at the end of the Cold War, where civil society has collapsed, people are not being paid, people are living in a situation where they may not see food for weeks. The supply chain is destroyed, and they have access to material that is highly valuable to both other nation states and sub-state actors, then I think you have to be very, very concerned. I think one other thing that we briefly touched on in the beginning is also this deteriorating relationship between the US and Russia. I think that is going to have significant impacts over the next decade on bilateral arrangements, obviously between the US and Russia, but also multilateral arrangements or engagements with nuclear newcomer states. Look at Ukraine, for example. Ukraine, those of you who've taken my class, know that Ukraine was one of the 4 states that suddenly found themselves as a nuclear weapons state at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union dissolved. The other 3, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia itself, of course. Ukraine disarmed. They repatriated their nuclear weapons that they had suddenly become the proud owners of, back to Russia under some fairly serious commitments on the part of US, Russia, and Britain, promoting or promising to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, now, clearly Russia has backed off on that in a fairly significant manner. And for those of you who watch the Russian language media and the Ukrainian parliament, Ukraine has actually put forth in their parliament a bill to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and establish a nuclear weapons program. Now, it will probably die in their version of Congress, I hope. This is one of the cases where a Congress that does nothing would be an excellent solution. But it's disconcerting that people are starting to think that. And so what does that mean for trying to develop a political solution for controlling Iran's breakout capability? Well, why would Iran believe that these sort of international commitments are any more binding than the agreements that led to disarmament of Ukraine? So I think this issue of both regime stability and regional and international commitment and stability on that front is really important for this longer term question. But I think I got the question.
I've gotten the question now. I am concerned nonetheless with regard to Brandon. I agree with you about not overdoing or overstating the concept of threat, and yes, the costs of preventing a low probability event can be exceedingly great. But nonetheless, these threats have happened. I mean, I don't believe that 9/11 was well predicted, and certainly not well. We were not well prepared when that occurred. I am in agreement with both Howard and Brandon on the idea of non-state actors or terrorist groups because of the difficulty of, by definition, of engaging them in a conversation that gets them to have some stake in or some responsibility in what they plan to do with their ideology. That is something I think is it's the wild card in this whole thing over the next 5 to 10 years. Yes, there's relatively few now that may have the motivation to do that, but or the capability to do that. But combined with the fact that you've got failing or failed states, you can get a combination between interested parties with a grievance and a failed state that provides a temporary home until something else. I mean, in the old days we used to call these proxies, but a temporary home until they accomplish their spectacular objective, and then they go back into the caves and the burrows. So I still have a concern that there are things that we cannot predict, we cannot know. And the only conclusion is that we continue to have the efforts directed at agreements, conversations, engagement, constructive engagements with the states that will cooperate, and a permanent vigilance and forensic work to try to detect these operations that are enriching uranium or trying to, conspiring to hijack it and use it for their own purposes.
Thank you, gentlemen. The conversation so far is focused on nuclear in terms of weapons. We shift gears a little bit and think about nuclear and its alternative uses, nuclear power in particular. I had the opportunity to visit the Watts Bar nuclear facility a couple of months ago, and my reaction once I got inside the control room was, oh my goodness, Where's the security? There was security, but it was very disconcerting. So each of you speak a little bit to non-weapons uses of nuclear materials, nuclear facilities, nuclear power facilities, or other nuclear materials, and the potential for that to become a significant threat to the American people.
Would you like me to start? Okay, so I'll take Brandon off the point here for the moment. I think there's a couple of issues around nuclear power that are very, very different from nuclear weapons usable materials. First of all, reactors, at least US reactors, are for the most part fueled with very low enriched uranium. So uranium typically enriched to about 5% or less in uranium-235. The advantage of that from a security standpoint and from a proliferation standpoint is it's essentially impossible, I wouldn't say completely impossible, but essentially impossible to do anything nefarious with that low of an enrichment. There's a reason that our weapons program uses highly enriched uranium, because you get a feasible volume to give you a nuclear bank. In the event, in the scenario of a nuclear reactor, what you're looking for is a very large fuel volume that is going to burn very slowly because you are trying to produce power over a long period of time. In the case of a typical reactor, you're looking at an 18-month to 3-year cycle that you want to burn that fuel. So, from the standpoint of material at risk, it's a different environment. Now, certainly, nuclear reactors are critical infrastructure. Nuclear reactors, as we saw in Fukushima, if there is a massive failure, can cause local radiological contamination. But that's a world of difference in terms of impact from what we would expect from a nuclear detonation. So, for example, everyone here, I'm sure, has followed with great interest the accident at Fukushima Daiichi in Japan, where there were multiple reactors that failed, multiple reactors that breached. How many of you know how many people died at Fukushima Daiichi from nuclear issues?
Zero.
Close. There were 3 people killed in the plant.
But
2 people drowned when the wave overwashed the room they were in, and 1 person had a heart attack.
but those are clear.
Those are not nuclear, it's agreed, I agree, but they were at least at the plant. Even today, people are not moving back to Fukushima Daiichi Prefect, but the best health physics studies say, in fact, they could. That except for a very limited area right around the plant, the impact to human health is moderate at best, in most cases, immeasurable. So, certainly there was a great deal of public fear. There was a massive economic impact. There was a substantial embarrassment of the state. You know, Japan is still reeling from the fact that they basically mismanaged their regulatory function. So there are huge impacts from it, but they're not the same as if you suddenly lost 100,000 people in a major metropolitan area anywhere in the world. It doesn't. I mean, everyone always imagines the bomb will go off in New York. You know, I guess New York likes to think they're the center of the world. But if the bomb goes off in London, the bomb goes off in Rome, the bomb goes off in Moscow, the bomb goes off in Beijing, it will be the same effect. I think we would see overreactions that would make the actions after 9/11 pale in comparison to such a thing. Whereas, you know, with the case of nuclear power, I think even the overreactions that occurred after Fukushima Daiichi didn't rise at that level. The other piece, of course, that we shouldn't forget is the big benefit that you get from nuclear power is you get lots of good baseload electricity and you don't get lots of carbon dioxide. So nuclear power brings some serious benefits in that regard. Now, the Secretary of State has publicly stated that the biggest threat the United States faces in the foreseeable future is climate change. I'm not sure I'm ready to buy that statement as quite as strongly as he made it. But if you're going to deal with climate change, you've got to have a significant component of nuclear power in the mix. And so I think we also have to look at the cost and the benefits associated with that.
I absolutely agree with you. A couple points. One is, I think the case in Fukushima that as I understand it, farmers are unable to sell produce that would be grown on that land because of public perception. So they're still essentially out of business, and that's the kind of economic impact that would occur with any kind of catastrophe or terrorist event. Or after 3 Mile Island, if you recall, in 1979, there was quite a period of public concern and evacuation from the area. I don't believe anybody lost their life in the 3 Mile Island event. But it was the perception that kept down property values and economic activity in that area for a long time afterwards. The other point I was going to make was exactly what you raised about climate change and the role that nuclear power has to play in that scenario. If I were a terrorist and the nation had turned 100% to solar and hydro, I would still target the basic infrastructure, and that might mean solar plants. So it's not necessarily that it's nuclear, it's that it's so damaging if you were to attack it. But in the case of nuclear power, my understanding, and you're more familiar with this than I, my understanding is that the newer designs have much better safeguards than the older designs on reactors. They're smaller, more easy to defend or protect, and would not have some of the consequences that the earlier light water reactor or boiling water reactors had or could have. So I'm optimistic in that perspective, and that's, I think, all I need to say on it. This looks working.
This works. I won't say much. I was going to say that if there are certain things that need to be protected or hardened, nuclear power plants seem to be at top of the list. So I do think that if we're going to spend money on trying to protect ourselves from potential terrorist attack, there are certain things in our infrastructure that warrant monies being spent, and nuclear power plants seem reasonable to me. Although I think if I was a terrorist, I think I'd get more bang for the buck by blowing a chemical plant than blowing a nuclear plant. Right? I mean, think of Bhopal, India, in which methyl isocyanate was released, and 5,000 people, 4,000 people were killed as a result of sabotage. So it strikes me that there are other places that if I was a rational terrorist, that I would go to, but nuclear power plants are not the one. So yeah, I would harden it, but I don't think the money would necessarily be all that useful.
What is the role of academia? We think of the military-industrial complex as driving nuclear, particularly when it comes to weapons. But we have academicians here at this table. What is the role of academia in mitigating the problems associated with the proliferation of nuclear materials generally, and in particular, nuclear weapons?
Don't you start with that, Brad?
Oh, Bruce, you have to start. I want you.
I'm going to give a shout out to Tom Graham. I think one of the role of academics, this was a need that he was pointing out, was we need to train a generation of students, academics, who are capable of doing this engagement with foreign countries. We need to train negotiators. We need to train people in arms control and disarmament. And his point was, his generation is retiring. So that's something that academics can do right now.
I think I certainly agree with all that. In fact, there's a fair bit of evidence that the U.S. And other nations, particularly the first 5 weapon states, and some of the international bodies like the IAEA, are facing some serious demographic challenges. There are questions as to who will do this job in the future, and how do we make sure that people, first of all, get interested in it, and secondly, how do we make sure that they are capable and competent so that when they are hired by National Nuclear Security Administration or the IAEA or Rosatom or whoever, that they are actually capable of contributing to those organizations' missions. And I think the academic community has a strong role to play in that development of the human resource necessary for the field. I think the academic community also has an important role to play in research. There are things that are more readily tackled in the academic community than in government laboratories. The universities have greater freedom to ask certain questions because they are not necessarily directly funded by federal sponsors on certain areas that you have to make sure that you comply with administration policy. You can't get crosswise with a particular agency, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, we all know in the academic community that if you do get crosswise with an agency, you have academic freedom, but you also have the academic freedom that they will never fund you again. And so that becomes a de facto challenge. But if you start asking hard questions about, well, why hasn't the United States undertaken disarmament as it agreed to, and as is in fact the law of the land under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you can raise those questions in academia, whereas if you were an employee of the State Department or an employee of the Department of Energy, it's a much more awkward situation for you to try to raise that question, at least in an open forum. So I think academics has an important role there. And I think academics also has an important role as a trusted outsider, outside the government construct, that can be a conduit and a vehicle for engagement on these policy issues with the public. How many of you believe that the way you tell a politician is lying by watching to see if his mouth is moving? Hopefully with professors, it's a little bit better than that. And so how do we play that role of serving as a trusted agent for the greater public at large?
I wouldn't add much. I guess the only thing I would add perhaps is that, yeah, I think that the right in the sense that academia should be a place where we question assumptions that ground out the policies that we have, and that actually that evaluate comparative risk and where we spend our money and how we spend our money, and so that academia should be a place where we do this. This policy in place, this amount of money we're spending, government bureaucracies typically their funding model is T-1, right? That's what we're going to do with T. I think academia serves as a place where we can challenge that funding model and suggest that perhaps this is not the best use of money, the wisest use of money to go to places that we actually can make it more bang for the buck. And I think also to assess what are the negative externalities of spending money in one area. What are the consequences of that, right? And if we can assess that a little bit, maybe we can construct what is more efficient or better public policy.
I'm going to move here in a moment to questions from the audience, but let me follow up on that. Brandon, you used some keywords there that we all appreciate as academicians in terms of our freedom and the questions we ask and things that we challenge in our thinking. James Doyle, a scientist at Los Alamos National Lab, was recently fired for his critique of the nation's path, its use of nuclear weapons. There was an exercise of what we would call perhaps academic freedom. I'd like to think we know the boundaries in the work that we do, but what is your reaction to James Doyle's actions and the actions that led to his termination?
Okay, let me begin and let me first stipulate that I have not read the specific article that was in question. One thing I think that may bear on that particular case is both Los Alamos, Livermore, and Lawrence Berkeley were unusual situations in the National Laboratory Complex up until the mid-2000s. These were labs that were managed by the University of California, and when I was working at Lawrence Livermore, I was a University of California employee. And as a University of California employee, there was an expectation of some level of academic freedom. And so it wasn't necessarily as broad as what we have here at the University of Tennessee, but there was some expectation of that, both on the part of the employees and on the part of the university as the manager of those laboratories. And there were cases where people expressed themselves in print or in public, and there would be a kerfluffle over what the person said, and the university would defend them, and the funding agencies would yell at them, and we would end up at some happy medium. First of all, that model changed with the privatization of those of two of those three laboratories. And so the presumption of academic freedom at Livermore and Los Alamos, I believe, is gone. That they are now standard, well, not standard, but pretty close to standard issue in that policy government contractors. And so they have to live under the constraints that those implications bring. Now, the specific details of Jim Doyle's case, I don't know for sure. And what has been reported in the press is typically only one side of that case. So I think it probably behooves us to be a little bit cautious about extrapolating too much there. But, you know, I do think it is worthwhile for our government and its agents in the laboratories to cultivate a comfort level, at least among their employees, in being able to raise pointed questions. You know, if you can't ask the hard questions, well, does that mean that suddenly you're not going to ask the easy questions and suddenly you're just going along for the ride, and then we end up at the end of a road wondering, how do we get here? So I think it's important that that questioning attitude be nurtured. I don't know that the details of this particular case, how that plays into it, but I would certainly encourage anyone in the audience who's here a little later this semester when the director of Los Alamos, Charlie McMillan, will be here to visit. Feel free to ask that question. It'd be interesting to see what he says.
If you're not on a contract.
If you're not on a contract, yes.
All right, thank you, folks. I'm going to open it up to questions. We are recording this, and so I'm going to walk around with the microphone. If you do have a question, raise your hand. I'll get the microphone in your hand. If you've got a question specifically for one of the panelists, please identify that person. If it's a general question, just throw the question out. So do we have any questions from the group? I'm going to start close, and we'll get over there to you in a moment.
Whenever we talk about nuclear security lately, last few years, we usually talk about Iran and North Korea. And I don't think we've talked about either one. So are things getting better in terms of nuclear security with Iran and North Korea, or just other things are happening that they're losing their top spots in terms of nuclear security concerns for us?
So I will defend myself. I did raise Iran, at least at one point, in the discussion about the impacts of the instability in Ukraine on any sort of political agreement there. From my perspective, I haven't seen a lot that leads me to believe that Iran is changing their spots. And so I think the issue remains. I think the issue is somewhat better, at least in that there are now negotiations ongoing that were not ongoing before. But those negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere particularly fast. So I remain concerned about Iran. North Korea, of course, has detonated 3 devices. So there's no question that they are in the game, as it were. North Korea is probably the poster child of regimes that are stable because they have reverted to heavy authoritarian rule that Professor Prince spoke of. I don't think that's a sustainable model for me. And so as the North Korean society starts to open up, we had Sid Hecker here a few years ago, and he talked about his visits to North Korea and how you're now starting to see things like smartphones. Not a lot, just a trickle coming into the hands of the elite in North Korea. And once you've got information channels, I think it becomes much harder to sustain the sort of heavy-handed authoritarian model that North Korea has been governed under than the last 40, almost 50 years. So I think the pattern with North Korea has typically been do something outrageous, try to get some concessions at the negotiating table, let things calm down, and then repeat. And so my suspicion is we'll see something outrageous in the near future. Whether it's be a nuclear test or another missile test, or my favorite one was when they came on the press and they showed their nuclear attack plans for the U.S. where they were going to bomb San Francisco and Austin, Texas. I've been to Austin, Texas. It really wouldn't break my heart. But yeah, it's the other UT. So I think they're still there, but I think, at least in my opinion, the resurgence of a hostile relationship between the U.S. and Russia is a bigger piece of the picture right now.
I absolutely agree with Howard's comments on Iran. North Korea, for many years, I've viewed it as it's kind of like the yapping little dog that. Well, I think it's very useful to China and China's foreign policy to have North Korea where it is doing what it's doing. And I think that continues as long as China thinks it's valuable. If you just consider what China's plans are in the South China Sea, which, by the way, the geographic boundaries of the South China Sea now extend to Singapore and Indonesia. And, this is an interesting expansion and a testing of the world environment by the Chinese regime. And I think North Korea serves its purpose. And as long as it does, things will continue the way they are, kind of haphazardly, with waiting for the next event.
So I'll just say a couple things. I do think that Bruce is right, that North Korea is useful for China, and it's a distraction for us. If they keep their nuclear program alive in the media, it distracts us and allows them to do a variety of things. So I do think it's in China's interest. I do think it's interesting that we hyperventilate to a great extent over both the Iranian and Korean nuclear programs. There was a lot of hyperventilating that went on in the 1960s when China was going to go nuclear. It was the rogue state. It was the state that had massacred its own people. It was the state that had initiated crises over islands like Matsu, and they cannot have a nuclear. We could not allow them to have a nuclear weapon because this was going to destabilize the entire world. And nobody talks about that anymore. Right? That's gone. If the question is, would I prefer in Iran to have a nuclear weapon to a nuclear weapon? Sure. But if the question is, if they decide to go nuclear, what are we willing to do? Obama has said that there are no options that are not on the table for preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. I'm not sure I would go that far, and I fear worse consequences for actually preventing Iran if they do decide to do it. There is actually social science evidence to suggest that crises are less likely to escalate if two states have nuclear weapons. So there is some evidence that suggests, and we see this with deterrence as well, right, that countries that have nuclear weapons, there is some stability that's provided. So whether or not that's the case in the Middle East, I don't know, and there obviously is some great risk in finding out, right? But it may be the case that rather than destabilizing the Middle East, an Iranian bomb would stabilize it. Now, we also have the case of the nuclear tests in India and Pakistan that happened in 1998. So after the Indians tested, there was lots of harping in the Indian press about how Pakistan is incapable of going nuclear, and they were being made fun of by the Indian press. And this, of course, increased the anxiety in Pakistan about how they need to demonstrate their nuclear ability, and then, of course, test it. But the night before the test, there was a report given to Pakistani Prime Minister by Saudi intelligence that Israeli planes were actually on their way to bomb nuclear facilities in Pakistan. And so missiles were rolled out, and there was great concern. So there is that concern as well, right? You can get these crises that might happen when states have nuclear weapons. But I do think that what's interesting is, if you go back and read the rhetoric around China's nuclear bomb and their nuclear, it's very, very similar to what one sees the language being used about Iran, and the same thing about North Korea, right? And people were talking about the proliferation chain was going to occur when North Korea went nuclear, and yet we don't. I mean, Taiwan didn't go nuclear, right? South Korea didn't go nuclear. Japan hasn't gone nuclear. In fact, if anything, nobody even cares anymore. I shouldn't say that, but it is obviously an issue. But it's not. It didn't result in the consequences, I think, that many people had predicted prior to them going nuclear. So we have to hesitate a little bit on whether or not military forces are going to solve that problem by taking it out.
Don't you think that we are way too fearful of nuclear war? I mean, it's really not that bad. I mean, it would be bad between, it would be bad between us and Russia. But we've had hundreds, maybe even 1,000 air tests since '45. North Korea just had 3. Nothing has happened. 0. I mean, a little strontium-90 in cow's milk in the 50s maybe, but all these bombs going off in the air haven't done a thing. Nagasaki and Hiroshima are doing fine. Pakistan could fight India today. Millions of people might die, but it wouldn't be a big deal for the world. Same with Israel. Israel and Iran, and of course in Iran, we're responsible for the Shah. I mean, the Iranians should really trust us, right? Iran and Israel both could be wiped off the map, politically, and it wouldn't be any big deal. Most of you would probably disagree with me, but the basic question is, aren't we too afraid of the effects of nuclear war? And we have over 7 billion people on Earth. I mean, we get really disturbed over 3,000 people dying at the towers. But overall, nuclear weapons don't make that huge a difference. Disagree with me.
Okay, all right, I will take you up on the opportunity to disagree with you. First of all, the 1,000 or so tests that the U.S. has conducted, the vast majority of those occurred anywhere between 400 and 4,000 feet deep in the Nevada desert. So if we could confine the
Britain, France, Soviet Union, the whole worldwide, they've blown up a bunch of
Sure.
air.
No air since the 60s. But if we could confine a nuclear war to the remote desert of Nevada or the remote desert of Kazakhstan, probably wouldn't be so bad. If you start thinking about nuclear warfare as a potentially acceptable outcome, then I think you have to really question the value of human life. Because if you look, for example, at one of the currently deployed systems in the Russian arsenal, the SS-18 missile, carries a 10 megaton warhead. And if you run the calculations, that 10 megaton warhead by itself at the proper height of burst would kill everyone from Chattanooga to the Kentucky border in East Tennessee. And so, is that acceptable? I would claim no.
I was talking about limited nuclear war, not between us and Russia.
That's one weapon. So, I think, well, first of all, I really don't want to run the experiment to see if you're right or if I'm right. I think that would be awkward for the participants, and getting it approved by our institutional review board would be sort of challenging. I think the consequence, even if you discount the loss of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of human life, the consequences politically and the consequences economically would be so grave in a world that is now so interconnected that I don't think we would view it as not such a big deal at all. But perhaps you can speak to the interconnectedness of the economies.
Well, I think it's absolutely true. Our evaluation of human life is such that I would never go so far as to say it's a trivial matter to have a nuclear war. I do think in your statements, though, you need to distinguish between a nuclear event and a nuclear war. What we've been talking about here was more than anything, a discussion about preventing nuclear events, which might only be one weapon. Nuclear war, you're dialing us back to mutually assured destruction and the concept of, or the notion that came up in the late 50s, and I remember sitting in my elementary school with my hands over my head in the hallway as part of civil defense in 1957. The concept that by the early 60s it emerged that there were so many warheads that the matter was really how many times over do you want to kill your opponent? And then even if you distinguish between counter-value, which was cities, and counter-force, which was military bases and missile silos, and tried to make fine distinctions between what was more important to hit first in a no first strike scenario, all that got to be very esoteric, but the fundamental issue was, as Howard is saying, one of these weapons is capable of doing a vast amount of destruction.
But you're drifting in the U.S. versus Russia. I mean, the problems are, smaller wars, Pakistan, India, Iran, and Israel. The world is perfectly capable of surviving those conflicts.
Well, who would be rebuilding?
And doing well.
The American taxpayer would probably be helping one of those countries rebuild afterwards. So just from the standpoint of the American taxpayer, I'd like to think that Pakistan and India didn't get into a nuclear shooting match. It definitely impacts the world economy if you're talking about those countries.
I would agree, but
The costs are high.
there's no huge amount of fear we need to have over this. I mean, it would cause some problems, but it's not the end of the world.
Okay, so maybe it's not fear, maybe it's prudence and forethought before you engage in anything like that, rather than being fearful
I
about
agree
it.
with you there.
All right.
Do we have other questions?
Well, may I add to that, just quickly, of course, the assumption is a couple of exchanges in nuclear war and we wait and see how the dust settles and
Please.
make sure everybody's okay.
We need to use the microphone.
But your point of a few people losing a few 100,000 people has some credibility, and maybe we shouldn't fear that, but what's the likelihood that it's going to stop there? And if the probability is high that only a couple of exchanges would take place, great. But if there's a good probability that this is going to continue, therein lies the issue, and that's the one we've had great concern with about Russia. Why could we assume that other countries are not going to have this continuing exchange after one or two cities have been blown up?
And why are we pushing Russia with NATO? We're shoving NATO in their face.
Okay, let's move along here, folks. Another question.
I have a question on a different topic. My question is specifically for Dr. Prinz. We had this discussion in Dr. Hall's class yesterday, and you had a couple remarks that I wanted to get your opinion on. You talked earlier in your opening statements about going to a global zero with our nuclear weapons as through our reduction agencies, but then mentioned later that Iran getting a nuclear weapon could potentially stabilize the Middle East. So in your opinion, would you consider going to a global zero to be desirable? And if it is desirable, would you consider it feasible? Or what steps would we need to take to get it feasible?
This is a good question. But I go, to a certain extent, I go back and forth. I mean, I think there are very good arguments about why nuclear weapons help to stabilize relations among countries, and clearly because they increase the cost of war, they decrease the probability of war, right? And so if we reduce the number of weapons, are we not then potentially increasing the probability of war, maybe even among major powers? And so can you get to global zero, and then two, are there really some really negative externalities that come from it? Now, that may be the case. I do think it might be possible to get to a strategic minimal nuclear deterrent, which is not 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons on warheads that are ready to be launched on a minute and a half or something, right? I mean, that strikes me as absurd. And I think that the number of targets that we have in this country, and probably Russia has, are way, way, way too many, right? I mean, I assume we have 1550 because something the DoD said. We have that many targets, and we need this many missiles to hit that many targets, right? We can't hit with just one, 2 megaton warhead. We need to hit them with 3 or 5 or something. So I do think it's absurd we have that many. Can we get down to 350 or 450 or something like that? Obama has proposed doing this in 2 or 3 stages. Getting to global zero, it goes down to 1,000, it goes down to 500. Once you get down to 500, then you're at a level playing field with countries like France and Great Britain, and maybe you can bring them into the mix now and begin to negotiate verification. You can begin to negotiate with these countries, getting rid of the remaining missiles, and verify that that actually is being done. You know, it is an interesting problem. There are plenty of academics. Joe Joffe has argued that there's absolutely no way we should go that far. In fact, if you start going down to low numbers, that what you do is increase first strike problems, right? Because then you can actually take out one's missiles, which of course then raises the fear that one wants to launch first. To ensure that your missiles aren't taken out, we're back to before we had second strike capabilities. And so there actually is a benefit to having lots and lots of nuclear warheads. But that being said, I do think it is easier, it strikes me, in verifying no nuclear materials and no facilities than it is to verify small numbers of them, right? Because then everybody's still going to have enrichment facilities, and you have to try to verify where those things are. But if nobody can have enrichment facilities, then maybe that's easier to verify. So maybe going to global zero actually provides some easier verification things than perhaps smaller numbers. It's a really difficult problem. It's not obvious to me whether we can get to zero or whether it would be a good thing, and whether it will increase probability of war. But I think deterrence model says it doesn't.
Since I gave him that question in class yesterday, I appreciate that you think it's a really good, difficult question.
So we talk about the modernization of weapons and the stability of weapons that are decaying, things like this, the usefulness and efficacy of those things. We know that like Russia is concerned about modernization. So I haven't heard too much talk about China. I'm interested in some of maybe talking about modernization there, because I know that NNSA is very concerned with shock physics and lots of things that go into like how we maintain weapons and things like. We had a talk very recently on the HFP. Is that the right acronym? The UFP, Uranium Processing Facility. UPF. That people want to be built on for what's well. Basically because of the decaying infrastructure for these weapons. So not only demographic challenges, but we also have infrastructure challenges for maintaining the nuclear force that we currently have. So what's the next 5 to 10 years look for that? For maintaining the infrastructure and the demographic challenges for not just us, but China and Russia and the rest of the world.
Well, I think I'll take the first look at this, then I'll let my colleagues weigh in if they wish. I think there are, I don't know any specific details about what China's doing, but there is a great deal of concern in the international community and in the U.S. NGO community about upgrades and modernization to U.S. weapons as being a signal that, again, coming back to the NPT in Article 6, that the U.S. sees the role of nuclear weapons in its national strategy as perpetual. And so that I think there is a concern from that standpoint. On the other hand, from the standpoint of the government and multiple administrations, because these things span Republican and Democratic administrations, there is a philosophy that as long as we're going to have weapons, as long as the president believes that they're necessary to our defense, that we have an obligation to make sure that they are safe, secure, and reliable. In other words, that they don't go off when you don't want them to. They are where you expect them to be, so you keep track of them. And if you do need them to go off, that they'll actually work. And so some of the modernization challenges for the specific systems are driven by that sort of question, the long-term reliability. Some of them are driven by evolving mission issues. So for example, if you're trying to reduce the number of what we call tactical weapons now, which are largely gravity bombs delivered by aircraft, you have to, if you're trying to do the same mission, if you're trying to hold the same number of targets at risk with a fewer number of weapons, because you're reducing the number of weapons, well, maybe you need to be a little bit more certain that the weapon will actually hit the right target. So you see things like modifications on the V-61 to try to make sure that it's a little bit more accurate when it lands. So I think there's some trade-offs there. If you turn your question to the facilities, we have a significant challenge in the U.S. of trying to maintain to modern standards the safety and security of operations with this very important nuclear material. That, as we mentioned earlier, the material is really the obstacle for a substate actor to be able to develop. The access material is the obstacle for a substate actor to be able to develop a nuclear threat device. If we're trying to do that in facilities that date back to the Manhattan Project, there are definitely some compromises. When we engaged the Manhattan Project, that was wartime. There was not an immediate threat of land invasion of the U.S., so the facilities were built to produce material as quickly as they could. And then, as we've gone on year after year, we've sort of added on layer after layer of incremental capability, either for the operations or for security or for safety. And so by the time you end up here, 70 some odd years later, it's a bit of a Rube Goldberg approach. Whereas the uranium processing facility, like the HEUMF, the highly enriched uranium materials facility, the storage facility, you have the opportunity, if you do those things, and they're non-trivial things to do. The UPF has lots of challenges that face it. But if you do that, you have the opportunity to at least sort of bring the whole operation up to code, as it were. So you can certainly improve security, safety, potentially operational stability and so forth by those sort of investments. But make no mistake, those are massive investments to do that. These are unique facilities, one-of-a-kind facilities, and if anything, we've demonstrated over the last 30 or so years, the U.S. is really good at making unique one-off facilities very expensive. And so these are no different.
That capability is true in other countries too. I mean, even I have no doubt that the Chinese, when their warheads have aged enough and their guidance systems and targeting systems have improved in accuracy enough, that they too will find the capability to reduce the number of warheads because they now have more accurate warheads. And that actually, I think, is behind the UK's announcement to cut the number of warheads on our ballistic missile subs from 48 to 40. Well, that comes about through improvements in accuracy. So it gives them, it also cuts their costs because then they don't have to worry about the lifetime extension or life extension programs for all those warheads. So that's, I have no doubt that the Chinese face cost issues and the same problems with their warheads as the Russians and the United States does.
So the only thing I would say is that with regard to modernization programs, I think one has to be concerned about what are the proliferation cost modernization programs. That is, if we institute these kinds of programs, what signal is it sent to the international community and non-nuclear weapon states about our pledge to actually honor Article 6 of the NPT, and whether that actually creates more proliferation concerns than it does by not investing in these kinds of programs. And clearly, I think it is used by NNWSs right now in the review conferences as a way backing the United States and Russia for actually not honoring their pledge. And if we need cooperation to actually help stop proliferation, particularly with regard to interdiction, intelligence, we need these countries on board. We need their cooperation to achieve what our proliferation successes. And these kinds of programs, I think, at times can present problems.
Okay, folks, we're about out of time. I'm going to let this gentleman ask a question, a short question, and then short response from our panel, please.
My question kind of bounces off of the Global Zero question earlier. If we were to eventually someday say start decreasing our stockpile sizes and really start looking like we're heading towards Global Zero, what are some considerations that would have to be taken as far as weaponization of biological and chemical components as well? And certainly, could some of the existing infrastructure that we have and some of the existing regimes, such as the Boston Agreement or the Australia Group, in addition to maybe some of the safeguards techniques that we utilize currently, do you feel that those could be tailored to kind of cover that sort of an area, or would new, more robust agreements have to be made?
Well, let me take a shot at the technical aspects of that question, and then I'll defer to Dr. Brandon for some of the political aspects of that question. One of the real challenges with particularly biological agents or biowarfare agents is, now I'll admit I'm speaking from my perspective as a nuclear guy. You know, bio stuff scares the crap out of me. Why does it scare me? One, it is the ultimate in low profile. And some of you are amateur beer makers. You're doing basically fermentation of biological agents in your kitchen or garage or wherever it is you do your beer making. The technology is quite simple from that standpoint. Couple that with the frankly astonishing advances that have been made in genetics and genetic engineering. For example, the smallpox genome has been fully mapped and is available on the internet. Smallpox as a disease is considered eradicated. I'm probably of the last generation that was routinely vaccinated against smallpox. For those of you who are students here, I bet you haven't been vaccinated. And you don't have that big brown scar on your arm that those of us of my age all share. So the ability to take that information, meld it with technology that is becoming increasingly common, increasingly available to produce genetically modified organisms, and couple that into a population that has no herd immunity whatsoever to that agent, that's really scary. Chemical warfare agents, we've had a very different regime on chemical warfare agents than we've had on nuclear weapons. The agreement, or at least the stated agreement on chemical weapons, has been that there shall be zero. Now, people have not honored that, but that is the international demand, that there be zero. And certainly I think we've seen folks move to that. CW agents have challenges with it. They're difficult to deliver. They're not particularly militarily useful. They're really good weapons of civilian casualty producing, but not so good from a military standpoint. So I think you've got a combination of both the international norms against having them and the low efficacy of those sort of weapons has really diminished the spread of them. Biological weapons, I think it's an open question. So.
Obviously, Matt's calling us. It's time to go. I'll just say, I do think we need a host of new agreements. If we were going to go to Global Zero, we need a host of new agreements that are going to be required, like National Fuel Bank, variety of verification mechanisms. And so we're going to need a host of new agreements before that's actually going to succeed.
I'd like to ask the final question. We're out of time. If I had the chance, I'd ask, why does it matter if a few thousand people died from chemical or biological weapons? But I won't ask that question. I would ask that you give our panel a warm applause for their participation.